Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, we drift back in time to a year unlike any other. A year that cast the world into darkness, not by war nor conquest, but by something silent, something hidden, something far beyond the grasp of kings or prophets. This is the story of the year 536, known by many as the worst year to be alive. Let the candles burn low, and close your eyes, as we journey slowly into the fog. There were no cries in the heavens, no thunderous roar that tore through the valleys, no trumpet of doom nor herald of prophecy that reached the ears of mankind to prepare them for what was coming, only a quiet stillness, a subtle turning of the wind, and then, almost imperceptibly at first, the light began to fade. In lands that stretched from the green hills of Ireland to the rocky shores of Anatolia, from the stone cities of Rome to the rice terraces of far-off China, people began to notice that the sun no longer rose as it had the day before. It still climbed above the horizon, true enough, but what once had been a golden beacon casting warmth and clarity across the earth was now pale, ghostly, dimmed by something unseen. The light did not vanish completely, but it dulled and flickered as though veiled behind some distant and unnatural curtain, and though none yet understood it, a shadow had descended upon the world. Farmers were often the first to notice these kinds of things, for they lived by the sky and by the soil, and each passing season was a lesson written in weather. In the early months of that year, they looked up from their frozen furrows and squinted at the heavens with a growing unease. The morning frost lingered too long. The dew refused to lift. The air, even in the season that should have promised rebirth, felt stagnant and oddly silent. There were fewer birds in the trees, fewer bees in the air, and the buds that had bravely pushed through the soil in the first days of spring seemed reluctant to continue their journey. Some withered outright, curling as if in confusion, unsure whether to bloom or to sleep again. The warmth they needed would not come. And yet there was no storm, no towering clouds, no torrential rains. It was not a tempest that had frightened the world into submission, but a grayness, a haze that dulled all things. Travelers who moved between towns remarked that the days felt shorter, not in hours, but in brightness, and that even at noon the sun looked no stronger than it once did in early dusk. And while people still moved about their daily tasks, tending animals, gathering firewood, preparing for the planting, there was an unspoken hesitance in their rhythm, as though they were acting against some instinct whispering that things were not as they should be. People began to watch the sky more often, their eyes filled not with awe but with suspicion. The skies themselves told no story. They offered no signs, no patterns, only a constant, weary veil. Some thought it a trick of the weather, that perhaps the season had changed its mind, or the gods were displeased. In the distant lands of the Eastern Empire, where scribes recorded the passing of days with meticulous care, there were notes in the margins that spoke of a sun without light, of shadows cast even at midday. And in Constantinople, whispers traveled faster than truth. The priests said it was a punishment, while the traders said it was bad luck from far-off lands. Farmers blamed the cities. The cities blamed the heavens. But no one could name the cause, and that ignorance began to rot at the edge of people's minds. In the north, where the air was already chill even in the best of times, the cold began to bite earlier and harder than expected. Shepherds wrapped their cloaks tighter and brought their flocks down from the hills sooner than usual. Fires burned in hearths even in months when they should have been stored away. And the forests, once alive with the calls of creatures and the rustling of underbrush, seemed quieter than they had ever been. Travelers remarked on the silence, saying it felt as if the land itself were holding its breath. In village markets, the first hints of tension appeared. Crops planted in the early months were stunted or failed to sprout altogether. The small baskets of produce that did make it to the stalls were fewer, smaller, and browner than before. Housewives shook their heads and made do, but merchants frowned and counted fewer coins. Children went to bed with half-full bellies, and though they did not yet know it, their hunger would not pass with the next sunrise. And still the sun did not shine. No messages arrived to explain the dimness. No armies marched. No celestial event declared itself in the sky. There was only the quiet persistence of the gray, settling deeper into the bones of every man, woman, and child who looked to the heavens and found no answers. In temples and churches, prayers were offered with increasing desperation. In homes and huts, candles burned longer, even during the day, their dim flames mocking the brightness that once poured freely through the windows. And on the sea, where sailors trusted the stars and the winds to guide them, the veiled skies brought unease. For if the heavens could not be trusted, what else might fail? But of course, it was not merely a question of faith or farming or the warmth of the sun. This dimming, this slow fading of the world's light, was a herald. It was the first, soft knocking at the door of disaster, a door behind which 1,000 sorrows waited patiently to enter. The people of 536 did not yet know that their world had shifted beneath them. They did not yet see the road that led from hunger to plague, from uncertainty to death. They only knew that the light had changed, and that they no longer trusted the dawn to bring comfort. And so they waited, uncertain and cold, beneath skies that watched but did not speak, in lands where the seasons forgot their order, and where the first seeds of ruin had only just begun to fall, invisible and silent, like ash from a fire no one had seen. It was not merely that the days had grown colder or that the mornings lingered with an unnatural chill. It was something deeper, something more unsettling, for those who looked to the heavens each day found themselves staring at a sun that no longer behaved like the one they had known all their lives. It still rose, as it always had, from behind the distant hills or above the silent forests, but it emerged reluctantly now, hesitant and pale, casting a dim silver light that seemed to skim over the world rather than embrace it. It was no longer golden, no longer warm, no longer a herald of hope or labor, but something distant, colorless, strange, a cold eye in a sky veiled with ash, giving just enough light to see the contours of the earth, but never enough to feel its life. And so, as spring passed into what should have been summer, entire regions waited for a warmth that never came. The sun climbed through the sky, yes, but it gave no heat. Its rays reached the fields, but did not stir the seeds beneath. In cities and villages alike, people spoke in hushed tones of the sun's failure, as though speaking too boldly might offend whatever spirit had stolen its fire. Some believed the gods had turned away. Others thought the sun had grown old, as people do, and would now decline into shadow. In the streets of Constantinople, rumors swirled like dust in the wind. Some claimed that the end of days was upon them, that the heavens had cracked, or that fire from beneath the earth had poisoned the skies. And all the while, the sun hung there above them, silent and weak, offering no answers and no comfort. Crops that had pushed through the soil curled inward, as if trying to hide from the false daylight. The leaves on trees turned yellow too early and fell in a soft, sorrowful rain upon roads that had once bustled with carts and travelers, but now lay mostly quiet, the air too cold, too dry, too uncertain. Children stopped playing outdoors for long hours, drawn instead to hearths that burned longer each day. And even animals seemed to sense the change. Birds migrating far too soon, livestock growing thin despite careful tending, and wolves coming closer to human settlements, as if sensing something unnatural in the balance of the world. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the way time itself seemed to lose its rhythm. The passing of days had always been marked by the movement of light, the golden rise of dawn, the hot brilliance of midday, the amber descent into evening, but now all those divisions blurred. The sky remained a sullen gray from morning until night, and shadows that once shifted with the sun now remained fixed and vague, never fully defined, like the thoughts of those who gazed upon them. People began losing track of the hour, of the day, even of the month. The world felt suspended, caught in a dull twilight that refused to yield or to deepen. In Rome, the streets echoed with fewer footsteps. In Alexandria, the libraries burned more candles than usual, even at noon, just so scribes could continue their careful copying by a light more reliable than the heavens. In Antioch, shopkeepers opened their stalls later and closed them earlier, for what good was commerce in a world where seasons rebelled and the sun abandoned its duties? Even the temples felt changed. Priests performed rituals with more urgency now, lighting incense with shaking hands and uttering prayers with a brittle edge of fear. For while they could offer explanations to their congregations, warnings of divine wrath or omens of cosmic correction, even they, in their secret thoughts, wondered if something far older and deeper had stirred. Some wrote of the suns dimming in their records, though most could offer no cause. In the Byzantine court, advisors to the emperor whispered about strange mists rising from unknown lands, of volcanic tremors reported by passing merchants, of distant mountains that belched smoke into the heavens and stained the sky with soot. But there was no confirmation, no single disaster they could point to, only the evidence above them, day after day, that something had gone terribly wrong. And so they debated and prayed and watched, while in the streets outside their palaces, the poor began to line up in longer queues at bakeries with empty shelves and soup pots barely filled. The light, when it came, seemed filtered, not through clouds, but through something far more ominous. A fine gray veil, invisible to the eye yet felt by the heart, dulled every color. Blues were muted. Greens looked sickly. Even fire, once bold and orange, now seemed to burn less brightly, as though the very nature of flame had lost some of its confidence in this altered world. And in places where snow should never have fallen, it arrived anyway, in summer no less, coating olive groves and vineyards in a crystalline silence that stole what little hope the farmers still clung to. In China, scribes recorded the appearance of yellow dust in the air, of snow falling like ash in the height of summer, of harvests failing across entire provinces. In Ireland, annals would later speak of bread failing and darkness lasting from one season into the next. In Syria, theologians looked to the Book of Revelation, fearing that the fourth seal had been broken. In every corner of the known world, disconnected yet united by the same darkening skies, people came to the same wordless conclusion, that the sun itself, the heart of life, had become a stranger. And so life continued, but not in the way it once had. Everything moved a little slower, a little quieter, as though the world had begun to mourn something it could not name. Fields were plowed, but with little hope. Children were fed, but with less joy. Weddings were held in dim churches with candles guttering in cold draughts. Deaths were marked with more solemnity than ever before, for even in mourning, people sensed that their sorrow was now shared by the very earth beneath them. And above it all, the sun still hovered, silent, pale, and altered, its familiar face masked behind a veil of ancient smoke or ice or mystery, leaving only the question that no one could answer: would it ever return to what it once was? And as that question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, the people of the earth looked toward the coming months, not with hope, but with a creeping awareness that this dimness was not a momentary passing, not a single strange season to be endured, but the beginning of something far longer and far more difficult, a slow decline, a cold unraveling, a seasonless age that threatened to unmake the world one harvest at a time. By the time summer should have arrived in full, with long days soaked in sunlight, ripening fields golden with promise, and warm winds sweeping through orchards heavy with fruit, the earth had already begun to understand, in its slow and sorrowful way, that the season would not come. What should have been a time of life and abundance felt instead like an early autumn stretched thin across the months, a gray echo of warmth that never fully arrived. In the villages that dotted the Roman countryside, the meadows did not sing with insects, and the birds that might once have woven nests in hedgerows or called out across the river banks were fewer, quieter, and altogether absent from some regions. There were still blossoms in some places, still leaves upon the trees, but they looked tired, stunted, curled, unsure whether they should grow or sleep, as if the world's natural calendar had fallen into disrepair and no one could quite remember how to fix it. The sun continued its dull imitation of brightness, but it offered no clarity and no heat. In cities and in farmland alike, people watched the skies with increasing unease, their eyes lingering not only on the pale disk that should have been the sun, but also on the strange shadows it cast, faint, crooked, sometimes double-edged, as though the light that fell from the heavens had passed through a veil too thick to give clean shapes. Time blurred. Days slid into one another without the punctuation of brightness and warmth, and people began to live more by memory than by season, remembering what summer once felt like, what food once tasted like, and what it meant to wake and feel assured of what the day might bring. In the hills of Gaul, shepherds noticed their flocks growing thin despite good pasture land. The grasses, though present, were brittle and strange, dry to the touch and lacking the richness they should have drawn from the soil. In the markets of North Africa, merchants looked with dismay upon sacks of grain that were lighter than they should have been, their contents shriveled and sour-smelling, as if the earth had tried and failed to grow food properly, embarrassed by its own inability to nourish. And in the homes of the poor, where dinner had always been a modest affair to begin with, the evening meal became quieter, more desperate, built from what could be foraged or stretched or replaced, roots boiled in thin water, acorns ground into paste, a crust of stale bread softened in wine. Even the air felt different. In places once known for their fragrant breezes, the lavender-swept plains of Provence, the olive groves of Greece, there came instead a kind of metallic scent, dry and unfamiliar, like the trace of smoke carried from a fire that had burned far too long ago. Travelers on foot and horseback reported a persistent haze clinging to the lowlands and gathering in the forested valleys, a mist that never quite lifted, even at midday. And though it did not sting the eyes or choke the throat, it seemed to hang with intention, as if it were watching, waiting, pressing gently against every surface, reminding all who passed beneath it that the world they once knew had slipped quietly into some new and less forgiving version of itself. Still, people tried to carry on. There was always a kind of stubbornness in the human spirit, an unwillingness to surrender to despair even when every sign pointed toward decline. Farmers sowed seeds again, hoping that the warmth would return, that the sun would gather strength, that this was merely a passing oddity in a world that had seen many strange years before. Some even convinced themselves that perhaps next week, or the week after, the skies would clear and the brightness would come rushing back in like a long-lost friend. But even the most hopeful among them could not ignore the signs entirely. The cold that lingered in the soil, the dew that stayed into the afternoon, the fruit that never ripened but instead dropped prematurely, hard and bitter and useless to eat. Weddings were postponed. Festivals were cancelled or reduced to small gatherings around weak fires. The songs that once marked the turning of the year, songs of planting and harvest, of midsummer joy and sun-drenched celebrations, were left unsung. Children who might have once splashed in rivers or played in dusty roads beneath a blazing sky now remained indoors, swaddled in cloaks even in July, their laughter dulled by the constant chill. And the elders, those who had lived through wars and famines and the turning of many decades, began to murmur among themselves that they had never seen anything quite like this. Even the old winters had never lasted this long. Even the worst summers of their youth had not been so bleak, so colorless, so endlessly gray. In monasteries perched atop remote cliffs, monks recorded these changes in the margins of manuscripts, not as headlines but as quiet observations, that the sun's face was dim, that crops were failing, that illness had begun to spread in the nearby towns. In the east, Chinese court historians noted snow falling in midsummer and grain prices rising to levels so high that commoners were forced to eat bark and weeds. In the north, in the highlands of what would one day be called Scotland, tales spread of a darkness that walked through the land like a giant, turning daylight into dusk and stealing the breath of animals as they slept. These were not always factual reports, not always measured or scientific, but they captured the truth of the feeling that something vast and unseen had wrapped itself around the earth and was slowly squeezing the life from it. And yet, despite the growing evidence, there was no single name people could give to their suffering. There was no declared war, no invading army, no locust swarm blackening the skies. There was only this slow unraveling, this relentless dimness that seemed to drain not only the light from the world but the will from its people. And as summer passed without ever truly arriving, those who had once prayed for sun now prayed simply for survival. Not abundance, not ease, but just enough warmth to grow food, just enough light to see a future. In some regions, whispers began to stir about the possible cause. Travelers from the far north spoke of a distant mountain that had erupted months ago, though few could say where it was or how its fire had reached the skies. Others suggested that God had turned his face from mankind, that sins had grown too many, or that demons had risen from the earth's core to poison the wind. In the marketplaces and temples, in the courts and the hovels, everyone had a theory, but no one had an answer. The sun still shone, yes, but it shone like a dying ember, and no one knew whether it would recover or simply continue to fade, until the world was left in silence and cold forever. And so, with fields half-planted and fruit trees bare, with animals growing thinner and stores of grain growing smaller, the people looked ahead not to harvest but to hardship. They began to prepare in quiet, desperate ways, hiding food, mending clothes, sealing windows against the wind, knowing that something worse might yet come, though they could not say what. And in the stillness of long gray evenings, as the sky hovered between dusk and night without ever fully choosing either, they waited, listening not for thunder or trumpet, but for the sound of their own endurance, tested now by a summer that had forgotten to be warm. By the time the third moon of the dimmed summer had passed, and the world still remained trapped in its cold gray veil, some began to wonder if the answer to their suffering did not lie in the heavens at all, but somewhere deep beneath their feet, in the rumbling silence of the earth itself. For although no great explosion had shaken the cities, and no mountain near to them had split or bled fire in their sight, strange stories began to emerge from the outer edges of the world, stories of mountains that groaned, of red skies that shimmered with ash, of rivers that steamed and forests that smoldered without flame. And though these tales came from far places, passed from trader to traveler to priest to scribe, they all hinted at the same unspoken truth, that perhaps the sun had not dimmed on its own, but had been hidden, veiled, smothered by something vast and violent that had burned long ago and far away. In the northern oceans, long ships from distant coasts told of snow falling in midsummer, and of ice returning to harbors where it had long since melted away. In the far east, messengers described a strange dust in the sky, fine as flour, clinging to rooftops and caught in the fur of animals, as if a powder had been sprinkled across the land by some unseen hand. And in the cold wastes near the edges of the known world, in the islands we now know as Iceland, or perhaps in the hidden craters of the Americas, or in some long-sleeping vent beneath the seas, something had erupted with a force beyond measure, long before word could reach the empires, and long before the world could comprehend what had been loosed into the sky. But there were no witnesses left to describe the moment. No one in Constantinople or Alexandria or Chang'an had seen the fire rise or heard the mountain roar. If it had happened, it had done so in a place so remote, so forgotten, that it had vanished into the earth again without leaving a name. And yet its breath was everywhere, in the ash that circled the globe, invisible but thick enough to blot out the sun, in the faint smell of sulfur that lingered in some valleys, in the colors of sunsets that now glowed red for hours, eerily beautiful, even as they chilled the skin. The world was breathing smoke from a fire it could not locate, and even those who believed in omens and curses began to suspect that this was not the work of gods, but of the planet itself, groaning in pain. In the east, a Buddhist monk in the court of Wei wrote of the yellow haze that dims the heavens, and in the mountains of Armenia, shepherds told of snow falling in harvest time and water freezing even as it flowed. These were not rumors now, but observations, scattered, solemn notes written into margins and scrolls, carried across continents by men too old to lie and too weary to wonder. The earth had darkened, and the question that no one could answer was why. But a few, a very few, began to whisper about volcanoes, those deep-chested giants that slept for centuries beneath their caps of snow, only to rise without warning and drown the sky in fire. Some spoke of Iceland, that distant land of ice and flame where smoke could rise without warning from the black hills and poison the clouds for leagues in every direction. Others spoke of the Americas, still largely unknown to those across the sea, where vast, hidden mountains may have burst like stars and vanished again beneath forests. And some suspected the far islands of Indonesia, with their ancient ridges and calderas, places like Krakatoa, whose name would echo centuries later, but whose fires may already have stirred once before, quietly and catastrophically. But whether it came from north or south, east or west, the fire had already burned, and the smoke had already spread. There was no stopping it, no way to reverse it. The particles launched high into the stratosphere, sulfur aerosols, fine ash, and volcanic dust, remained suspended above the clouds, invisible yet impenetrable, forming a filter so high and so widespread that the sun's rays could no longer reach the earth with their full strength. The planet had not been plunged into night, but into a muted half-light, a twilight that stretched across months, then years, dulling the colors of the world and lowering the temperature of the air, as if the whole of creation had stepped into a shadow too vast to measure. And beneath that shadow, the earth grew quiet. Forests did not rustle with summer wind as they once had. Rivers slowed, their banks shrunken by reduced snowmelt. Birds migrated in the wrong directions or did not return at all. Entire flocks of animals vanished into deeper wilderness, unable to find the food they needed in the stunted fields. And humans, those clever, tenacious creatures who had endured so many centuries of storms and wars, now faced a different kind of challenge, not one of violence or conquest, but of emptiness, of empty skies, empty fields, empty stomachs. In towns where firewood had always been saved for autumn, hearths burned well into July. In monasteries where monks once labored with quills and ink, their fingers stiffened in the chill and their ink froze in the inkwells. The silence of frost replaced the songs of summer. And every morning, when the sun rose, its light seemed filtered through smoke, its warmth like breath behind cloth, and people began to forget what it had once felt like to feel true heat upon the skin. The sky itself had changed color, taking on a flat pewter hue that dulled even the brightest colors, as though the entire world had been painted over with ash water. There were no maps to trace the disaster, no scholars with instruments to measure the veil above. There were only the symptoms, the darkness, the cold, the famine, and the fear. And in time, the idea of the volcano became less of a theory and more of a legend, whispered by travelers and pondered by priests, a monstrous fire in a far-off land that had cursed the world without warning and would never be seen again. But the damage had already been done. The veil was already in place, and the fire, though long since cooled, still burned in the sky above them, not with light, but with memory. And so the people of 536 did not speak of eruption or aerosol or climate impact, for such words had not yet been invented. They spoke instead of gloom, of judgment, of a world turned strange. But even if they could not name it, they felt its weight upon their backs, in the weariness that set in too soon each day, in the hunger that crept into every household, in the cold that reached through shutters and doors as if it had been invited inside. And as they looked to the horizon and saw no change, no break in the clouds, no fire in the sky, but only the dull smear of another gray dawn, they began to understand, with quiet certainty, that this fire, this hidden fire, would linger long after its embers had died. The fog that settled over the world was not just a haze of ash or mist, nor merely a blanket of atmospheric anomaly. It was, to the people of 536, a shroud of confusion, of dread, and of deep, inescapable foreboding, for as the sun refused to break through the thick gray veil, and as the light that once danced on leaves, rooftops, and the ripples of river water turned dim and sullen, it seemed to those who lived beneath it that the gods had turned their faces away, that the heavens had grown tired of mankind, and that some unspoken punishment had been cast down from on high. And though they did not yet understand the full extent of what was to come, the people began to feel it, not just in their eyes which strained against the dimness, nor in their chests which tightened from the chill that the sun no longer chased away, but in their very spirits, which dulled with the persistent grayness of the sky, with the silence that came when birds stopped singing and farmers ceased whistling, when even the laughter of children became rare and unnatural, like something inappropriate in a time that demanded only fear, silence, and reverence for a world that had suddenly changed without explanation or mercy. It was in the great cities first where murmurs turned to questions and questions turned to panic, for as the sunless days passed, Those who governed and those who studied the heavens began to argue, to debate, to fear that the firmament itself had shifted or that some supernatural reckoning was unfolding, and in Constantinople the scholars gathered beneath oil lamps to chart the movements of stars that no longer shone, trying to reconcile their calculations with a night sky that yielded no light and a daytime that mimicked dusk, while in the marketplaces the people bought candles and rush lamps with whatever coins they had left, crowding into churches and temples to pray beneath stone arches that echoed their despair, hoping for an answer that no priest nor astrologer could offer with any certainty, only vague notions of omens and sins, of curses spoken in ancient tongues or prophecies now fulfilled in soot and silence. Further west, in the once bustling reaches of the old Roman lands, the strangeness deepened, for in places like Gaul and Britannia, the weather began to behave like a creature unchained, no longer bound to the familiar rhythms of spring or summer, of harvest or rest, but instead lashing out in strange patterns, delivering frost when there should have been warmth, or rains that refused to end, drenching the fields again and again until they became lakes of rot and decay, and the farmers there, brows furrowed and their feet sinking into sodden ground, stared at the sky not in hope of rain, as they once had, but in the fearful anticipation that it would never stop, or worse, that it would stop and be replaced by a dry, gray cold that cracked the soil like old pottery and withered the remaining crops before they had a chance to rise. And then, as weeks became months and the darkness did not lift, the consequences of the missing sun began to emerge not only in mood and myth, but in the very fabric of daily life. For with the sun obscured, the growing season faltered, and seeds that had been carefully buried in spring failed to rise by midsummer, or if they rose at all, they were pale and brittle, stunted shadows of the harvests that had once filled granaries and storerooms with security and peace of mind, and those who had never once questioned whether their bread would rise or their children would eat began to do just that, watching the tiny loaves diminish, the pots of stew thin into broth, and the stored fruits wither in damp cellars, mold creeping in like a silent thief in the night, until every meal became an act of uncertainty and every stomach growled with suspicion that tomorrow might bring even less. In the northern reaches, where life had always been lived at the edge of hardship, the darkness brought not only hunger but disarray, for the snow arrived earlier than it should have, and when it came, it clung to the earth like a warning, a signal that what little remained of the warm season had been stolen by whatever power now held the sky in its grasp, and the herds that once grazed along the hillsides began to dwindle, either from lack of forage or from the chill that crept through their thick hides and settled in their bones, and the herders, wrapped in wool cloaks and doubt, began to consider the terrible choices that winter would force upon them, whether to slaughter the animals early for fear of losing them to exposure or to wait and risk starvation before spring, which itself had grown uncertain, perhaps even unreachable, as if the calendar itself had fallen into disorder along with the weather and the sun. Even the seas, which once carried ships from port to port with the promise of goods and trade, began to reflect the world's unease, for with the sun obscured and the winds unpredictable, captains grew hesitant to launch their vessels, unsure if the familiar stars would be visible to guide them, or if the storms, now fiercer and more sudden than ever, would rise from the horizon and dash their hopes against rocks hidden beneath black waves. And so trade slowed, then halted, and with it came the loss of spices and oils, of fabrics and wine, but more than these luxuries, the loss of salt, so vital for preserving what little food remained, began to bite deeply, especially in the inland regions, where the arrival of a salt trader once meant the difference between survival and spoilage, between a winter endured and a winter feared. And in the silence of the monasteries and scriptoriums, the monks who had long chronicled the affairs of kings and councils began instead to write of the strange days, of skies gone mad and stars extinguished, of darkness that lingered and cold that refused to lift, and some of them, their hands trembling beneath rough wool sleeves, dared to whisper that the end of days had come, that the world had slipped into the grasp of death, not sudden and fiery as in the ancient stories, but slow and lingering, like a candle snuffed yet still warm, its wick curling in the dark, a sign of a flame that once was but would never be again. And so, as 536 deepened in its gray and heavy sorrow, the world began to move more slowly, not only because the days were dim or the roads were slick with endless drizzle, but because the people themselves moved with a kind of weary caution, as if unsure whether the ground would still hold them, whether the breath in their lungs would stay warm enough to sustain them, and as they clutched their cloaks tighter and drew nearer to their hearths, the question that none could ask aloud began to grow. Louder in their hearts, had the world broken, and if so, what would come next? It was not only the forests and fields that felt the slow erosion of vitality, nor just the valleys that remained cloaked in gray, but even the air itself seemed to mourn the decline of the world. A dryness hung over the land that was not of heat, nor of wind, but of absence, the absence of clarity, of sun, of certainty. Across the distant reaches of the Eastern Empire, beyond the smoke-veiled plains of Anatolia and through the bustling trade corridors of Syria, a new and invisible threat began to stir, one that would arrive without warning and leave no household untouched. Whispers carried along the Silk Road were first spoken with the air of rumor, that rats had begun to appear in great number in the harbor towns, that fleas were biting more viciously than before, that strange swellings were erupting beneath the skin of those who lived too close to the ports, or labored in the dark recesses of grain warehouses. Few at first paid heed to the strange illness, for the world was already filled with enough trouble, and many had grown weary of believing that matters could get worse. But worse they did become, and swiftly. In the year that followed the second failed harvest, as grain became dust in the granaries, and mold crept like ivy across the bread left too long to stale, the affliction that had begun as murmurs from the east spread with a terrifying certainty toward the heart of Byzantium. Constantinople, still shining in pale splendor beneath its hazy dome of dim skies, became the stage for something far more sinister than a failed crop or a cooling sun. It was here, amidst the winding streets and marbled halls, that the disease took root, not with the fury of war nor the fire of rebellion, but with the quiet, creeping dread of a tide that cannot be stopped. The people began to cough, at first, a rasping sound like dry parchment being torn. Their limbs trembled with fever. Black swellings blossomed in their armpits, their groins, their necks. Some bled from their mouths. Others went mad with pain. The priests offered prayers, but the prayers returned unanswered. The physicians opened veins, but no evil humors escaped. The sick died in the thousands, and still the bodies kept piling up. In the heart of the city, Emperor Justinian stood helpless before the rising tide of death that swelled within his own capital. This was no ordinary pestilence. It was the plague, what would later be known as the plague of Justinian, and though it would not reach its dreadful peak until years later, its seeds were planted in the choking soils of this shadowed decade, fed by famine, carried by trade, and shielded by the very clouds that had blotted out the sun. It would kill tens of millions across the known world, and yet in this moment, its early arrival was but another blow in a year already broken by cold and crop failure. Yet for those alive in that time, in the year 536, or the few years thereafter, there was no comfort in knowing what historians might call it later. There was only the stench of decay in the streets, the empty arms of mothers who had no children left to hold, and the howling of dogs that had no masters left to feed them. The plague moved with the caravans and the cargo ships, riding unseen among the goods that once connected empires and now served only to spread despair. Rats infested the holds of ships, unseen beneath bales of cloth and barrels of spice, and their fleas spread from dockside to dwelling, feeding and fleeing and feeding again. In Alexandria, the markets fell silent. In Antioch, the call to prayer rang out over empty streets. In Jerusalem, even the sacred walls could not keep the sickness from entering. It was as if the gods themselves had withdrawn their favor from the earth, leaving behind a realm of shadows where the only certainty was death. Farmers abandoned their fields. Merchants shuttered their stalls. Orphans wandered the roads in packs, gaunt and wild-eyed. Even those who survived the sickness lived in fear that it would return, and it would, again and again, for generations. The chronicles that survive from this time speak in tones both hushed and horrified. Procopius, a man who had seen empires rise and fall, wrote of corpses piled in the streets and ships filled with the dead floating aimlessly in the harbors. Burial grounds filled so quickly that mass graves became commonplace, and still they were not enough. Slaves were conscripted to carry bodies until they too fell ill. The air itself grew fetid, choked not only by volcanic ash and dust, but by the smell of rot and despair. And all the while, the sun did not return, not in its full strength, not as it once had. Each morning broke with a sickly glow. Each evening fell too soon. The seasons no longer obeyed their old patterns. Nature had slipped her reins, and the world floundered like a wounded beast stumbling blindly through a fog it could not escape. In this cold, dim, disease-ridden land, the survivors carried on as best they could. Fires were kept burning day and night to stave off the endless chill. People wore layers of cloth and wool, even indoors. Hunger gnawed at every village and town, and what little food could be grown or stored was hoarded behind guarded gates or hidden in cellars. Trade collapsed in many regions, and coin lost its meaning where bread could no longer be bought. In such places, barter returned, a relic of an earlier age, yet now necessary again. A sack of grain for a day's labor, a crust of bread for a favor, a blanket for a story. Civilization, once gilded in the trappings of empire, had begun to unwind itself, thread by thread, until only the barest, most desperate forms of life remained. And yet, still, the people lived. They built small fires in great ruins. They whispered songs in languages nearly forgotten. They carved hope into the walls of crumbling churches, scratched prayers into stone with broken tools. For though they lived in the darkest years that memory could record, there was in them some ember, faint, flickering, but alive. And from this ember would come the slow rekindling of the world, though they could not know it then. For now they waited. For now they endured. And outside their homes, the gray skies hung low as ever, a dull blanket draped over a weary world, as the long years of suffering ground slowly forward, one grim day at a time. And as the months continued to drag across the darkened face of the earth, and as the fires of the volcanoes cooled while the ash hung stubbornly in the still skies, another affliction began to take hold, one not born of fire or smoke or famine, but of something far more insidious, something microscopic, yet devastating, something that would, in its silent and invisible way, ripple through the weakened veins of a world already brought low by cold and hunger. It began, as so many catastrophes do, quietly, in a distant corner of the Eastern Roman Empire, known to history as Byzantium, a sprawling dominion still clinging to the grandeur of its classical past while wrestling daily with the complex and fragile mechanics of survival in a fractured and turbulent age. In the great city of Constantinople, whose golden domes and stone streets still echoed with the ambitions of emperors and the liturgies of priests, word began to spread of a strange illness, one unlike the common fevers and agues that had long been a part of life, but something darker, more virulent, and far more terrifying. Merchants whispered of swelling glands and sudden deaths, of ships docking from Egypt with fewer sailors than they had departed with, of streets mysteriously quiet in Alexandrian markets that once rang with haggling voices. In time, the whispers grew louder, and the stories reached the ears of Emperor Justinian himself, a ruler of formidable will and tireless energy, a man bent on restoring the Roman Empire's ancient glory through law, architecture, and conquest. And yet, even his imperial authority, clad in silk and gold, would prove powerless before the encroaching specter that now crept silently across trade routes and along the hulls of grain ships, slipping past city gates and into homes where fires burned low and bellies groaned with hunger. The disease moved quickly, so quickly that there seemed little time to prepare or understand. People fell ill in the morning and died by nightfall, their bodies twisted with fever, their lymph nodes swollen grotesquely beneath the arms and in the groin, sometimes rupturing in ways so hideous that even seasoned physicians recoiled. The air was thick with the stench of sweat and decay, and the prayers of the dying merged with the chants of monks who wandered the streets offering last rites in voices hoarse with exhaustion. Entire neighborhoods of Constantinople fell silent as the plague advanced like a shadow with no edge, swallowing families, guilds, and districts in great gulps of silence. This was the plague of Justinian, named not for the emperor's pride, but for the time in which it struck, and it would leave a mark on the world as cruel and defining as the volcanic ash that had clouded the skies just a few years before. It is thought today by scholars and scientists that the disease was a form of bubonic plague, carried by fleas that lived upon rats, themselves stowaways on the very ships that kept the empire's breadbasket stocked. The irony was bitter, that the grain meant to stave off famine also brought with it a far more immediate death. But at the time, there was no germ theory, no understanding of bacteria, no explanation that could provide comfort or strategy. There were only signs and prayers and guesses, and the mounting pile of corpses that filled the streets, and the groans of those digging pits deep enough to hold the dead. As the disease tore through Constantinople, striking down citizens and senators, priests and prostitutes alike, Justinian himself fell ill, a moment that seemed to shake the confidence of even the most stoic. The emperor's survival was uncertain for many days, and though he would eventually recover, the empire he hoped to rebuild never truly would. The plague returned in waves, again and again over the decades, each recurrence sapping what little strength remained in an empire already pushed to its limit by war, rebellion, and natural disaster. Trade faltered, cities emptied, and the threads that held the far-flung provinces together grew brittle and frayed, snapping in some places entirely. The economy collapsed, labor became scarce, and the price of survival rose higher than most could afford to pay. Outside the imperial palace, life was reduced to a quiet terror. People no longer gathered in squares or markets unless absolutely necessary. The sound of funeral bells replaced the chatter of gossip and trade. Survivors often moved silently through the city, covering their faces with cloth, not out of knowledge of contagion but out of dread, out of the desperate hope that anonymity might protect them from whatever wrath had been loosed upon the world. And always, just beyond the edge of every prayer and every sigh, was the memory of the sun that no longer shone brightly, and of crops that no longer grew as they should, and of winters that overstayed their welcome. In the countryside, things were little better. With famine and frost already devastating rural communities, the plague spread quickly among villages ill-equipped to respond. Few physicians traveled beyond city walls, and even fewer returned. Priests moved from hamlet to hamlet offering spiritual comfort, often staying just long enough to catch the illness themselves. Carts piled with the dead became a common sight, pulled by oxen or mourners too broken by grief to cry. In some places, entire settlements disappeared, swallowed by disease and silence, leaving only sagging rooftops and hollow churches behind as mute memorials to lives snuffed out without witness. And through it all, the world seemed to grow quieter, not in peace, but in despair. The great ambitions of men, of empire, of conquest, of wealth, were reduced to basic needs: food, shelter, warmth, and breath. The earth itself seemed indifferent to the suffering it now hosted. The sun still refused to shine with its old strength. The rains came too late or not at all. Crops failed season after season. Children born in these years knew nothing of prosperity or hope. They grew up amidst graves, their lullabies sung by mothers with hollow eyes, their playthings fashioned from broken tools and discarded relics of a more hopeful past. And yet, even in this suffocating gloom, humanity endured, not through strength or courage, but through stubbornness, through the sheer inability to vanish entirely. People dug graves and tilled the frozen earth. They stitched clothes from old fabric and built fires from ruined beams. They prayed, they whispered stories of warmer days, and they watched the horizon not for armies, but for signs that perhaps, just perhaps, the darkness might one day lift. And as this dim hope lingered, a flickering thought not yet extinguished, the plague's grip finally began to loosen, not in triumph, but in retreat, as if even death itself had grown tired of the harvest. And so, as the slow-moving veil of ash continued its silent conquest over skies that had once been bright and filled with promise, the people below, those who still clung to the fading rhythm of the seasons, began to feel a different kind of chill, one that seemed to seep not just through the cracks in their thatched rooftops or the gaps in their thin woolen garments, but deep into the fabric of their lives and hopes. For with the sun's retreat came the inevitable decay of nature's bounty, and with each passing day, the fragile thread by which their survival dangled frayed a little more, until it began to snap entirely in places where hunger no longer whispered but screamed, and famine began to cast its long, emaciated shadow across villages, towns, and kingdoms alike, reducing once fertile fields to barren swaths of mud and dust where nothing took root and nothing answered the desperate pleas of trembling hands thrust into soil that had forgotten how to nurture. In the fields where men once sang as they sowed, there was now only silence and the occasional coughing cry of a child too weak to stand, his body little more than bone and breath, his eyes sunken and wide, searching not for joy or play, but for a crumb, a root, a miracle. And when that miracle did not arrive, as it often did not, the living began to shrink in number and in spirit, their forms gaunt, their movements slow, their dreams filled with smoke and ghosts and the haunting memory of meals long past. In such times, even kings and chieftains, cloaked in furs and seated at wooden tables still bearing the remnants of stored grains and salted meats, could not escape the creeping despair, for they saw in the thinning faces of their servants, in the emptiness of their granaries, in the stillness of their once bustling roads, the truth that no walls or power could insulate them entirely from the rot spreading through the very marrow of their realms. Barter became brittle. Commerce, once the lifeblood of city gates and village markets, withered as traders found no goods to sell and no strength to travel. Coin meant little when there was no bread to buy, and the rich became prisoners of their hoards, unable to eat gold, unable to feed their children with silver. Livestock, once plentiful, died either from starvation themselves or from being slaughtered too early in the desperate hope that one more mouthful might carry a family through the next moon. And when the cattle and the sheep were gone, some turned to dogs, and then to rats, and then to darker things still, for famine, when it grows deep and unchecked, does not only ravage the body, it begins to gnaw at the soul. And in this gnawing, communities began to fracture. Neighbor turned away from neighbor, and old bonds, once tied by blood or loyalty or simple human decency, loosened under the strain of survival, until they snapped with a violence both quiet and final. A loaf of bread stolen in the night, a barn locked against a begging child, a bowl of broth guarded with the wary eyes of a cornered beast. And so the famine reshaped the moral fabric of the world just as surely as it reshaped the land, reducing lush valleys to emptiness and bustling settlements to hollow echoes where only the wind remembered the names of those who once laughed there. But perhaps more painful than the physical ravages of hunger was the slow erasure of meaning that came with it. For when hunger lasts not for days or weeks, but for seasons, for years, it becomes difficult to remember a time when hunger was not the default state of being. And in this erosion of memory, identity begins to blur, and purpose begins to dissolve, until even the act of survival feels empty and automatic, a ghost-like persistence through days that have lost all distinction and through nights that bring no rest. Only the recurring ache of a stomach turned inwards on itself, and a heart too tired to beat with anything but weariness. And in monasteries, where monks had once illuminated manuscripts with golden inks and whispered prayers for rain and harvest, the chants now grew weaker, the pages smudged by shaking hands, the abbots gaunt and uncertain, for even faith found itself tested in a world where divine light seemed absent, where the sun itself, God's great lamp in the sky, had been extinguished without warning or reason. And so the words of Scripture felt increasingly like echoes from a world that had already ended, and the bells that called the faithful to prayer rang hollow in the gray air, as if asking not for worship but for answers. Thus, as the famine crept from coast to coast and from hill to valley, it left behind not only corpses and crumbling structures, but a silence that settled into the bones of the living, a silence that tasted of ash, of loss, of unanswered prayers. And it was in this silence, deeper than any that had come before it, that the people of the year 536 began to wonder whether this was truly a temporary affliction or the beginning of the end, not just of crops or cities, but of everything they had, once believed to be permanent, sacred, or real. And into that unsettling silence crept something new, a whisper carried by desperate winds and flickering torchlight, a whisper that would soon solidify into an even darker truth. That starvation, as devastating as it was, would not be the only plague to darken their days, for worse still waited in the shadows of this broken world. And so, the dimmed and dust-choked world of 536 continued its slow, mournful turning, each day merging almost imperceptibly into the next, as if time itself had grown weary beneath the heavy skies. And while peasants scoured the forest floors for roots or scraped lichen from stones to fill their aching stomachs, and while townsfolk bartered with increasing desperation for spoiled grain or bits of preserved meat long past its prime, somewhere far to the east, another threat stirred, a silent one. At first, its danger not announced by trumpet or tremor, but instead by the arrival of a single merchant who stumbled into a bustling port city with a hoarse cough and tired eyes, unremarkable in appearance, but bearing within him the seeds of something far more destructive than volcanic ash or failed harvests. For it would not be long before the first signs of a mysterious pestilence began to creep along the trade routes like shadows at twilight, unseen but relentless, carried not in sacks of spices or bolts of cloth, but within the very breath of travelers, spreading invisibly from market stalls and inns to temples and workshops, moving silently from hand to hand and mouth to mouth, until it began to take hold in the lungs of the unsuspecting, leaving behind trails of fevered moaning and hollowed-out homes where laughter once lived. In the beginning, it was ignored, attributed to the cold, damp air, or perhaps to the fatigue brought on by poor diets and endless anxiety, and even the physicians, such as they were, saw nothing out of the ordinary, for illnesses were common enough in these grim times, and they had no reason to suspect that this new wave of sickness would be anything more than another passing plague like those that had come before. But gradually, unmistakably, patterns began to form, patterns that stretched across regions, linking the fate of fishermen in Alexandria to the plight of shepherds in Antioch, uniting the symptoms of distant strangers in a web of suffering so vast that no one region could claim to be its source or escape its reach, and slowly, dread began to rise like mist in the valleys, clinging to skin and thought alike, for it became clear that this was no ordinary ailment but a harbinger of something far worse, and soon the names of loved ones were whispered in past tense there. Belongings passed on not with ceremony, but with haste, and the silence that followed each death settled over the land like dust from the dimmed sun, soft and total. Merchants who had once moved freely between ports now found themselves shunned or even stoned by fearful villagers unwilling to gamble with their lives. And in towns where hospitality had once been a sacred tradition, doors were bolted and shutters nailed closed, while letters and messages from distant cities began to speak of overwhelmed graveyards, of entire streets emptied overnight, of priests who collapsed mid-sermon and physicians who took to hiding, and though many tried to maintain their composure, hoping the illness would pass as others had, the death toll climbed too quickly, too mercilessly, eroding any illusion of control, until even the most skeptical began to pray, their words hurried and desperate, their rituals more frantic than faithful, for there was no longer time for slow hymns or careful offerings, not when the sickness moved so fast, and not when even the holy men themselves could be seen being carried away on stretchers, their skin pale, their breaths shallow, their robes soaked with fever sweat. And yet, it was not just the physical toll that crushed the spirit of the age, but the sense of betrayal felt by the people. Betrayal not by rulers or armies, but by the natural order itself, for to suffer famine and cold was one thing, but to be stalked by an invisible enemy that killed without pattern or mercy, that struck down children and elders alike, was something entirely different, something that shattered the quiet belief in balance that so many still clung to, even in their misery, and so they turned to superstition and prophecy, to omens in the clouds and birds that flew in strange formations, to ancient texts dug from the earth and cryptic dreams shared aloud in whispers, desperate to make sense of a world that had turned not just dark but unrecognizable, where logic seemed to no longer apply, and the air itself carried menace. By the time the full extent of the plague's reach was realized, it had already burrowed deep into the very arteries of empire, into Constantinople, where Emperor Justinian, already besieged by the failures of harvest and rising unrest, now found his court haunted by illness, and soon even he would fall ill, his body racked with fever, his courtiers uncertain whether the state itself would survive his possible death. And across the provinces, Soldiers weakened by hunger now faced a second, more insidious foe, for an army cannot march when half its men are coughing blood, and cities cannot defend themselves when their gates are guarded by the sick and dying, and so walls once meant to keep out raiders now became symbolic prisons, trapping the healthy and infected together in a swirl of uncertainty, fear, and resignation, while outside those gates, the countryside lay eerily quiet, with villages abandoned, roads empty save for the occasional wandering monk or corpse-strewn cart, and the land, what little remained fertile, left untended, for there were too few hands to work it and too little hope to make it worthwhile. But even as the plague spread, as mothers buried children and priests buried hope, the sky remained dim, as if in silent approval of the horrors it had helped unleash, and so the people, weakened and paranoid, began to wonder whether this was truly the end, an end not with trumpet and fire, but with silence and shadow, a slow undoing rather than a final blow. And it was in this mood of deep uncertainty that rumors began to grow louder of something more terrifying still, something that would strike not through illness or hunger or the cold emptiness of a sunless day, but through fire and blood, for as trade collapsed and cities weakened, borders once tightly held began to fray, and from the north and the east came whispers of armies on the move, of barbarian tribes who saw in the West's darkness an opportunity to strike, to raid, to burn, and perhaps to rebuild something in their own image, forged not from marble and faith, but from iron, ash, and the will to survive at any cost. And so, as famine and darkness clasped their cold fingers ever tighter around the remnants of the Roman world, and as people wandered both physically and spiritually in search of light that would not return, the despair of the year 536, and the years that followed, gave birth to another transformation, not one of nature or empire, but of the human soul itself. In the quiet corners of what had once been bustling cities, in crumbling monasteries and wind-beaten hamlets, individuals began to turn inward, not merely for spiritual salvation, though that remained constant, but also for the faint flickers of knowledge and reason that still lay hidden like embers buried under ash. As the sun failed to warm the skin or illuminate the ground, people began to realize that survival might not only mean finding food or avoiding plague, but also preserving thought, capturing the fleeting whispers of civilization before they were lost completely to the howling winds of oblivion. And thus, quietly and without grand declarations, a small number of monks, scribes, and hermits began the slow and deliberate process of copying ancient texts, illuminating manuscripts, and safeguarding stories of the world that had once been, lest the knowledge of centuries disappear like sunlight swallowed by volcanic fog. These fragile manuscripts, inked carefully by trembling hands beneath guttering oil lamps, spoke of stars, of medicine, of gods and kings, and of empires that had fallen long before the current one crumbled. The monks who preserved them knew not whether the words would ever again matter in a world so broken, and yet they wrote them all the same, driven by a quiet belief that the darkness would one day lift. They bound their parchments with humility, not imagining themselves as saviors of civilization, but merely caretakers of something that felt holy in its endurance. And all the while, beyond the heavy doors of their sanctuaries, the world remained cold and unforgiving. Illiteracy swept across villages where once children had learned Latin, and even spoken language began to fracture into dialects as isolated pockets of survivors developed their own ways to name the same bitter reality. Trade routes, already strained by war and famine, dissolved further. The roads of the once glorious Roman Empire fell into deeper disrepair, and travelers found themselves lost even in familiar landscapes, for landmarks had faded and forests had reclaimed paths once lined with statues and mile markers. Where once merchants had brought silk and spices, now wolves prowled and snow fell in seasons that made no sense. And so, with physical connection severed, it was only through these scattered manuscripts, tucked away in cellars, buried beneath chapels, guarded by cloisters of shivering men, that a thread of continuity endured. The written word, though silent, refused to die, and it would later be this quiet perseverance that would help stitch together the first fragile beginnings of rebirth in later centuries. But at the time, there was no such hope. The people did not imagine a future renaissance. They imagined only surviving another night, another week, another winter. And survival took many forms. Some bartered broken jewelry for stale bread. Some scavenged in once sacred temples now long abandoned. Some abandoned speech altogether, choosing silence over the burden of explaining suffering that could not be named. Children grew without memory of warmth, and their parents aged beyond their years, with cheeks hollow and eyes dull. The concept of time itself began to blur, for without harvest or growth, without celebration or season, one day melted indistinctly into the next. The sun, veiled perpetually by a gray and clinging gloom, no longer rose or set so much as it merely changed shade, darker, then slightly less so. It was in this muted world that new mythologies began to take root. In the absence of official decrees, of reliable news or imperial calendars, villagers began to invent explanations for the endless twilight. Some whispered that the gods had turned their backs. Others claimed the end times had arrived and that angels and demons warred above the clouds. And then there were those who believed the sun itself had died, murdered by unseen forces, perhaps in vengeance for the sins of mankind. These stories spread not through scrolls or sermons, but from lips to ears, often spoken by firelight with eyes wide and voices low. They filled the void where reason had failed, where science had no answers, and where suffering demanded a shape, even if that shape was monstrous. This proliferation of myth did not merely soothe frightened minds, it also reshaped culture. Songs turned into dirges, festivals disappeared, and old holidays, once marked with joy, were abandoned or morphed into fearful rituals. Where once people had danced for the coming of spring, they now sat in silence, afraid to hope. And yet, in this new, somber rhythm of life, there was also a strange kind of resilience. The human spirit, battered but not extinguished, continued to adapt. New customs were born not from triumph, but from necessity. People learned to live with less, to make do, to endure long stretches without color, taste, or light. And while most of the world forgot the finer points of philosophy or geometry, they remembered how to endure. They learned which bark could be boiled to stave off hunger. They knew which valleys held the least frost, even in midsummer. They taught their children how to skin a rat and how to sleep without dreams. And though these were not the lessons of golden ages or marble halls, they were the lessons that ensured humanity's persistence. It was not nobility or genius that carried the people through the long shadow of the mid-6th century. It was stubbornness, born from a refusal to fall completely into stillness. Yet even as myth flourished and civilization withered, there remained distant whispers of something older than gods, older even than memory. The earth itself, it seemed, had secrets buried deep below the frost and ash, waiting to stir again. And in the quiet tremors of the land, and the faint returning trickle of birdsong in some distant regions, there came the faintest sense that change, however slow, might yet be possible. And as the skies darkened with dust and the sun became a ghostly presence behind its veil, the great cities of the known world found themselves smothered not only by ash and famine but also by silence, a silence born from halted commerce, abandoned workshops, and the distant echoes of once thriving marketplaces now populated only by the wind and the weary. Constantinople, that once proud heart of the Byzantine world, where golden domes and crowded forums once glittered with commerce and debate, had grown strangely hushed. The markets, once filled with the scent of spices and the sounds of merchants calling out prices in many languages, had emptied, their stalls covered in fine layers of volcanic dust and sorrow. The imperial city, which had long imagined itself untouched by the misfortunes of the world beyond its walls, began to feel the slow unraveling of its illusion, as famine, fear, and political tension began to seep into its marble corridors and mighty basilicas. The Emperor Justinian, seated upon his golden throne beneath the mosaics of the great palace, found himself increasingly isolated from his people, surrounded by advisers who spoke in fearful whispers, hesitant to offer news that might deepen the emperor's despair. For while Justinian was a man of grand ambition, dreaming of reconquering the western provinces and restoring Rome's glory, he now found his energies consumed not by military campaigns or legal reforms, but by the quiet, desperate need to keep his people alive. Outside the palace, the citizens of Constantinople wandered in slow, aimless movements, their faces pale and pinched, their clothes threadbare from long use. The bread lines grew longer each day, winding through neighborhoods where children once played and neighbors once gathered in courtyards to share food and laughter. Bakers had closed their ovens, for there was little flour to knead, and the mills along the rivers had grown still, as shipments from the grain-rich provinces had ceased. The mighty granaries of Egypt, which once fed the empire with Nile-born abundance, were themselves suffering under failing crops and dying livestock. And so Constantinople, which had for centuries depended on its imperial reach to keep hunger at bay, now found itself starving alongside its distant provinces. The imperial granaries, though vast, could not conjure wheat from a sunless sky, and every loaf handed out by state workers felt like a borrowed moment against a backdrop of inevitable depletion. Amid the despair, disease began to spread. Not yet the great plague that would arrive a few years hence, but a sickness of the mind and body, born of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and the sheer weight of hopelessness. Children wasted away in their mothers' arms, elderly men died quietly in their sleep, and even the strong and healthy began to falter, their bodies unable to withstand the relentless hunger that drained their strength day after day. The city's hospitals overflowed with the ailing and the dying, while priests moved solemnly through the streets, swinging censers of incense to mask the stench of decay and offering prayers to a God who, it seemed to many, had turned his gaze elsewhere. And yet, through this fog of despair, whispers began to rise, not just in Constantinople, but in cities and villages across the world. Whispers of omens and prophecies, of divine wrath and apocalyptic visions. The strange darkness, the withered crops, the chill in the air, all were taken as signs that the end of days was at hand. Clerics and holy men interpreted the events as fulfillments of Scripture, while astrologers and philosophers argued bitterly over the causes and meaning of the sun's disappearance. In the monasteries, monks illuminated manuscripts with images of stars falling from the sky and cities devoured by fire. In the homes of the humble, families gathered by fading candlelight to murmur prayers and share scraps of food, unsure if they would see another sunrise. Across the sea, in Rome, the bishop, the man we now call the Pope, struggled to provide comfort to a flock that grew thinner and more frightened by the day. In Gaul and Hispania, in the remnants of the once great Western Roman Empire, warlords and tribal kings sought to take advantage of the chaos, raiding weakened towns and seizing storehouses, their swords as hungry as their men. And in the British Isles, where the old Roman influence had long faded into legend, chieftains and druids alike read the blackened skies as warnings of a world in decline, and in the mead halls, stories were told of ancient curses and vengeful spirits awakened by human folly. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the way time itself seemed to stretch and warp beneath the heavy curtain of darkness. Without the sun to mark the passing of hours, days became indistinct, blurring one into the next like brushstrokes of the same color on an endless canvas. Seasons lost their rhythm. People no longer spoke of spring or autumn, only of the cold time and the hunger time, for the usual signs of seasonal change were gone. Flowers no longer bloomed with the same certainty, and trees, confused by the dim light, failed to shed or bud as they once had. Farmers, unable to read the heavens or the soil, no longer knew when to plant or when to harvest, and so many did neither, abandoning their fields in favor of wandering in search of food or shelter. And through it all, the memories of what life had once been, of summer warmth, of golden afternoons in vineyard rows, of laughter drifting from sunlit courtyards, became more fragile with each passing week. People clung to these memories as one might hold a precious relic, whispering stories of brightness and joy to their children, as though hoping the mere telling might summon light into the present. And yet, no matter how vividly these tales were spun, they could not change the fact that the world was dark, and that it had remained so for months beyond counting, and that no one, not emperor nor bishop nor prophet, could say when the light would return. And so it went, day after day, week after week, month after month, with the sky a brooding shade of gray and the sun a dim memory fading into the fog of collective despair, while the seasons changed as they always had, but without the warmth or rhythm they once brought to the ancient patterns of life. It was in the 12th month of this drawn-out gloom that whispers began to rise in the wooden halls of old monasteries, in the cool echoing naves of stone churches, and in the dusty scroll-stacked chambers of scholars who studied the sky and searched the heavens for signs, because, as the darkness refused to lift, many began to believe that it was not simply a passing misfortune of nature, but something much more permanent, even divine, perhaps a judgment or omen, or some forgotten prophecy. Finally come true. The absence of sunlight did not just halt crops or confuse animals. It created an emotional and spiritual void, as if the hand of some invisible god had stretched across the sky to smother the light and leave only silence in its place. This was not a fear born of logic or science, nor even of the hunger gnawing at their bellies, but something far more unsettling, a fear of having been abandoned altogether. Across what would one day be called Europe, entire communities turned inward, both literally and figuratively, retreating from the wide roads and markets that once bustled with trade and conversation, and instead gathering around dim hearths or within crude sanctuaries to pray, to chant, to beg. And while some clergy clung to their scripture with trembling hands and cried that this was the end of days foretold in the Revelation, others wandered from village to village, barefoot and ragged, preaching repentance and waving crude crucifixes high into the dim air, convinced that only through suffering could the world be saved. In Ireland, the monks of Clonmacnoise and Bangor filled their manuscripts with strange, shadowed artwork, dark angels and fireless suns, and they recorded not merely dates or events, but feelings, visions, and portents. On the Italian peninsula, the papal scribes who once took pride in perfect Latin script now scrawled lopsided letters with shaking fingers, lamenting the collapse of trade and the collapse of faith in the same trembling breath. But it was not only in Christian lands that the weight of the darkness was felt. In Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, where mosaics glittered with gold and domes rose high above the streets, even Emperor Justinian's court could not ignore the signs. Astrologers there, whose scrolls were as ancient as the city itself, charted the sun's path with growing horror, for it was no longer a steady arc of predictable light, but a sullen, limping ghost across the heavens. Some, unwilling to admit confusion, blamed the stars, the comets, the misalignment of planets, or even distant wars. But a few, those less bound by fear or pride, began to realize that this was no temporary season of odd weather. They wrote, in quiet, tightly worded passages, of something deeper, something longer lasting, something from which the empire itself might not emerge whole. Trade routes that had once stretched from the Nile to the Danube began to shrivel, like old rope pulled too tight and left too long in the rain. Ships no longer arrived at their ports on time, if they arrived at all, and when they did, they often carried no goods but only rumors, and no spices but only sickness. Silks from the East became rare. Gold from Africa nearly disappeared. Even salt, that most basic of preserving tools, became precious, hoarded in dusty clay jars and locked away like treasure. A merchant class that had once sailed confidently across seas now found itself land-bound and uncertain, staring out into a fog that seemed eternal, as if time itself had stopped just offshore. And the people, rich and poor alike, began to hoard whatever they could: candles, dried beans, barley, roots, anything that could be kept in shadow and last through another month of uncertainty. Meanwhile, far to the east, the great steppes of Asia, where mounted warriors once thundered freely across the open land, began to wither beneath skies that refused to shift. In China, the emperors recorded strange occurrences: red snow, crops that refused to sprout, and lakes that froze in midsummer. Famine took hold in provinces once known for their abundance, and revolts began not from ideology, but from sheer desperation. The mandate of heaven, so central to the legitimacy of dynasties, was called into question by both peasant and noble. If the emperor could not call back the sun, then what power did he truly hold? And though no single empire fell that year, cracks began to form in the walls of every throne room, cracks that would widen with each passing season of darkness. In India, rivers like the Ganges and Indus continued their ancient flows, but the lands around them bore witness to a creeping hunger. Rice fields dried prematurely, palm trees withered, and temple priests found themselves tending not to worshippers, but to funeral rites, sometimes hundreds in a single week. Brahmin scribes described omens in the sky, rings around the moon, stars that flickered strangely, animals behaving erratically. And though their stories reached few ears beyond their borders, they joined the global chorus of quiet despair, a record of sadness being written not by victors or emperors, but by scribes, farmers, mothers, monks, those left behind to watch the slow unraveling. And so, by the time the second year of shadow began, there were already stories, spoken quietly over embers, or scratched into wooden slats, or whispered into children's ears as they lay beneath thin blankets on cold floors. Stories of a world that had tilted off its axis, stories of a time before the gray, when life had been loud and bright and full of rhythm. The elderly, those few who had lived long enough to remember the days when festivals filled the air with music and fires burned late into the night, became walking relics, keepers of lost warmth, murmuring to themselves of colors and flavors and feelings that now seemed more like myth than memory. Yet even then, in the face of such all-encompassing change, the human mind sought patterns, explanations, some thread of reason in the tangled darkness. And there were those, hidden in their cloisters and candlelit libraries, who began to suspect that this was not merely the punishment of heaven, nor the whim of stars, but something vast and real and physical, something born of fire and ash and mountain. These thinkers, unnamed in most records, quietly turned their attention not to prophecy or prayer, but to the earth itself, to the churning forces beneath the crust, and to the mountains that smoked at the edge of the known world. And so it was that the months dragged on, without reprieve, without restoration, and without the comforting signs of seasonal change that might once have offered solace to the aching spirit or reassurance to the doubting mind. In that long twilight that passed for summer, the earth remained cloaked in its cold gray veil, refusing to yield even the smallest gesture of warmth or renewal. It was during this lingering stagnation that the minds of the people, already worn and weary from hunger and cold, began to unravel more deeply into realms of unease that bordered on the uncanny. In a time without clarity, where days and nights blended indistinctly and the natural rhythms of the earth had fallen silent, a new fear took hold, not just of death or starvation, which by now had become familiar companions, but of forces unseen and forces unknown. For when the sun failed to rise, when the air grew still and birds no longer sang, many believed that the heavens themselves had turned away, and that what governed the skies had abandoned the world below. Whispers of supernatural judgment, long dormant in times of plenty, now rose to a steady murmur in villages, towns, and cities alike. The Church, which once offered structure in chaos and promise in darkness, found its priests and monks burdened beyond measure, unable to answer the relentless questions of the flock with the usual certainty. They too saw the signs, they too felt the unnatural chill, and in cloisters and monasteries, where candlelight barely pierced the gloom, even the most devout began to wonder whether this was not simply a trial, but the final reckoning itself. The scribes, who recorded events with methodical detachment, began inserting phrases once reserved for parable and prophecy, phrases like wrath of God and end of days. In the marketplaces, the sick and starving no longer looked merely to physicians or merchants, but to wandering prophets, who spoke in cryptic riddles or thunderous declarations, claiming the sins of man had darkened the sky and unsealed the gates of judgment. And yet, amid these proclamations, not all turned upward for explanation. In the East, astrologers studied the stars with desperate urgency, tracing patterns in the obscured heavens and calculating omens with trembling fingers. In Constantinople, learned men consulted ancient scrolls and Greek philosophy, wondering whether some vast celestial body had erupted, or whether the earth itself had shifted, its balance disturbed. They theorized that perhaps a veil of smoke, stretching from horizon to horizon, had been cast across the sky by some tremendous volcano or fire, and yet no fire they knew could blot out the sun across such an expanse for such a span of time. Others suggested that the moon had been wounded, its light dimmed and its strength lost, disturbing the tides and the air and the blood of man. But these were only speculations, offered in quiet chambers and scriptoriums, far from the open fears of the fields and streets. For most, it was not the explanation that mattered, but the unmistakable truth, that the old balance had broken, and the world as it had been was now something else, something colder, something crueler. It was in this new, shifting world, half remembered and half forsaken, that the bonds of society, already strained by famine and fear, began to loosen further. In regions where governance had always been fragile, warlords and petty kings began to rise, not through conquest, but through the promise of protection. Armed men were no longer viewed as threats but as necessities, and those who could offer even a small store of grain or a warm fire quickly found themselves followed, revered, or feared. In villages where once elders governed by custom and wisdom, now men ruled by strength alone, and the old order, built over generations, crumbled beneath the weight of desperation. Bartering replaced coinage, trust eroded, and in the shadows of failing cities, bands of raiders took to the roads, their faces covered not for anonymity, but to guard against the ash that still sometimes drifted like snow upon the wind. Trade, that fragile web that once connected distant kingdoms, had already begun to falter with the onset of famine, but now it fractured entirely. The caravans from Persia grew fewer, the ships from Alexandria stopped coming, and merchants from the west no longer risked the journey east. Along the great Silk Road, once teeming with goods and knowledge, silence now reigned, broken only by the occasional rumor of distant calamity. And when news did travel, it came in pieces. In the story of a drowned city, in the account of a once green island now lost beneath blackened skies, or in the mournful words of a traveler who had buried more companions than he could remember. Isolation deepened, and each community became a world unto itself, cut off from the broader currents of civilization, surviving, if it could, by its own meager means. And even as the world struggled in its new and frightening stillness, the earth itself, beneath all the smoke and shadow, stirred in ways unseen. Tremors were felt in distant lands, tremors that shook monasteries from Ireland to Armenia, as if the very bones of the world were shifting uneasily beneath the weight of what had come. Lakes swelled and dried unpredictably, strange animal migrations were reported, and harvests, when they came at all, bore fruit twisted and stunted, as if confused by the seasons that no longer aligned. Some said the rivers had changed their course, others that the wind now carried a scent of burning even in lands untouched by fire. Nature, like man, seemed confused, disoriented, and stripped of the guiding principles that once bound it in harmony. Yet it was perhaps the silence that haunted most deeply. In the forests, once alive with chirping, rustling, and the movements of unseen creatures, now only the wind stirred. In the towns, where the clatter of carts and voices had once created a tapestry of daily life, now there was mostly quiet, broken by coughing, crying, or the rasp of shovels digging shallow graves. And within homes, whether they be grand villas of nobility or the crumbling huts of serfs, families sat in darkness, not speaking, not moving, each lost in the heavy solitude of dread. For when the sky no longer turned and the stars no longer shone, the human heart, already burdened by so much grief, began to turn inward, and hope, that most fragile of lights, began to flicker low. But even in that grim and dwindling world, the story was not yet done, for there were other signs, other shifts on the horizon, some whispered in fear, others in awe, that signaled the next stage of this long, cold affliction. And as 537 approached, bringing with it the uncertain promise of another year, something even darker loomed on the edges of what remained of the known world, preparing to descend with a final cruelty upon a people already broken and breathless. And while the fields failed and the trade routes faltered and the chill crept further into every corner of the continent, those who still clung to authority, kings, bishops, magistrates, landowners, found themselves sitting atop broken thrones and hollowed estates, commanding fewer and fewer men, hearing fewer and fewer voices in the courts, as famine and fear drove even the loyal away into the wilds, or into the quiet stillness of death. And in this fragile and failing lattice of civilization, those old hierarchies that once dictated law and order began to dissolve like sugar in water, leaving behind a dangerous, bitter sediment where ambition grew unchecked and men without title grasped at power not through inherited right, but through the strength of their swords and the desperation of their followers. And nowhere was this more sharply felt than in the fractured remnants of the Western Roman Empire, where once proud provinces had now become petty kingdoms, ruled by warlords and would-be emperors whose crowns were forged not of gold but of violence and necessity. For in the absence of order, chaos does not merely creep in, it charges like a tide, and in 536 the tide was surging, and the lands that had once borne the grandeur of Rome, Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, Italia, now found themselves splintered into dozens of realms, each clinging to some semblance of rule, with dukes proclaiming themselves kings, and generals calling themselves emperors, while all around them the peasants starved, and the roads crumbled, and the letters from distant allies stopped coming all together, not out of treachery, but because the couriers no longer rode, and the bridges no longer stood, and the scribes had long since died or fled or burned their ink in the fire just to keep warm through the bitter nights of ash and frost. In Italy, the once glorious heart of the empire, the Ostrogoths, those Germanic successors to Roman rule, were themselves being unseated by the armies of Byzantium, for Emperor Justinian, ruling from far-off Constantinople, had resolved to reclaim the western lands not just for glory or faith, but for the very idea of Rome itself, and in doing so, he unleashed war upon a population already ravaged by hunger and cold, so that even as the skies refused the sun, and the trees refused their fruit, and the earth refused its grain, men were called once more to take up arms and bleed upon soil that no longer nourished them, their banners tattered, their weapons rusted, and their hearts drained of hope. And so the Gothic War began, a long, grinding struggle that would last nearly 2 decades, but whose roots were sunk deep in the mud of 536, when General Belisarius, the Byzantine commander, crossed into Italy, not knowing that the land he sought to conquer was already half dead, its cities shadowed by famine, its fields left fallow, its people broken by 2 years of darkness and despair. And as his soldiers marched, they found not a proud enemy awaiting them, but a landscape of silence and smoke, where villages stood empty, monasteries shuttered, and the wind carried not the sounds of battle but the echoes of grief. What might have once been a campaign of swift victories and jubilant liberations instead became a war of attrition through a desolate countryside, where securing supplies was harder than defeating the foe, and where even victorious soldiers perished not from wounds but from hunger and sickness, and the very ground they trod seemed cursed, the air thick with soot and the rivers choked with decay, and more than once Belisarius and his men asked themselves if the prize was worth the suffering, if restoring the name of Rome could justify the weight of so much loss. Yet orders were orders, and glory was a chain no lighter than duty, so the war pressed on, and with every passing month, more lives were swallowed into the dark mouth of history, nameless and forgotten beneath the veil of a dying world. It was not only in Italy that war took root, for as empires strained and borders blurred, conflict erupted elsewhere, in the Balkans, where Slavic tribes pressed into Byzantine lands in search of warmer soil and unguarded granaries, in Persia, where the Sassanid Empire watched Constantinople with wary eyes and began its own preparations for conquest, and in the British Isles, where the last Romanized enclaves were finally extinguished by Anglo-Saxon migrations, completing a long retreat into myth for the Roman idea in that corner of the world, and all of it, every battle, every siege, every fleeing refugee, was shaped not only by ambition and strategy, but by the strange, haunting atmosphere of those years, when the world itself seemed to be unraveling at the edges, and no ruler could rely on the seasons, and no general could trust the ground beneath his feet. And amid this backdrop of rising violence and falling empires, the people, the common people, the laborers, the herders, the craftsmen, the mothers, the monks, the scribes, the orphans, found themselves caught between dying kings and warring gods, forced to navigate a landscape more treacherous than any battlefield, where faith was both a torch in the darkness and a prison of false hope, where food was more valuable than gold, and where loyalty was given not to crown or creed, but to anyone who could promise a loaf of bread or a warm fire for the night, even if it meant betrayal, even if it meant forgetting everything that once defined them. For in the crucible of 536, the only law was survival, and everything else, culture, tradition, loyalty, honor, became fragile luxuries that could no longer be afforded in a world so thoroughly undone. And yet, even in such ruin, people persisted, because that is what people do, even when the stars disappear, and the gods fall silent, and the kings forget their names, and it is through that persistence, quiet, desperate, flickering, that the next part of this story begins, in a small, forgotten monastery on the edge of a darkened forest, where a single man begins to write down what he has seen, not for glory, not for posterity, but simply so that someone, somewhere, might remember what it was like to live in the year when the world seemed to end but didn't, and to suffer not for sins, nor for conquest, but simply because they happened to be alive in the shadow of ash and silence. And even as the natural world withered and turned against them, as crops failed and clouds swallowed the skies, there was something else, quieter, less visible, and yet perhaps more terrifying still, that slowly began to spread among the people of that darkened century. For when the skies grew dim and the soil stopped yielding what it once had, and when animals grew sick and famine knocked upon the doors of both the poor and the powerful, the mind too began to fray under the weight of so much uncertainty, for the human spirit, resilient as it might be, has always drawn strength from rhythms, the rising of the sun, the passing of the seasons, the dependable return of warmth and light. And when those rhythms falter, when they break without warning or pattern, there is a slow unraveling that begins, not in the limbs or stomach, but in the deeper places where hope and comprehension reside, and it was there, in the silent corridors of the mind, that the true magnitude of 536 began to take its heaviest toll. For no famine exists alone, no plague travels in isolation, and no darkness falls upon a society without inviting its darker thoughts to come crawling forth like insects awakened beneath a lifted stone. In that terrible year and the years that trailed behind it like shadows, as the darkness dragged on and the air remained cold and the sun refused to rise with the strength it once had, people began to see signs in everything. They read omens in the movements of birds, they feared the eclipse of the moon, they mistrusted the stars above them, and in that anxious, foggy landscape of the soul, many began to believe that they were being punished, not by the forces of nature, but by something greater, something divine or infernal, something ancient and wrathful that had grown weary of mankind's pride and had thus cast a veil over the world as punishment. And this belief, irrational as it may seem to the modern mind, took root with surprising ease, for the fear that lingered in the fields and the forests did not behave like any ordinary blight or storm. It was lingering, unexplainable, persistent, and where science and logic falter, superstition quickly steps in to fill the void. And so rumors began to spread with every caravan, with every monk traveling between monasteries, with every peasant murmuring to his neighbor beneath the blackened sky, and these rumors, like the darkness itself, were hard to pin down but impossible to ignore, that the sun had been eaten by a dragon, or swallowed by a curse, or that the end of the world, long foretold in sacred texts and whispered around sacred fires, had finally arrived and would soon consume all flesh and stone alike. And Though many still went about their business, plowing soil that would not yield, feeding livestock that would not fatten, there was now a growing heaviness, a dread that clung to them like a damp cloak, a sense that time had shifted, and that they now lived not in the same world as their fathers, but in some colder, crueler version of it, one ruled not by the gods of plenty, but by something far more indifferent, or perhaps even hostile, to human life. In churches and temples, prayers grew louder, longer, more desperate. Fasts were undertaken not merely to stretch food, but to beg for divine mercy. Sacrifices, both symbolic and grimly literal, were offered in remote corners of the world by people whose fear had eclipsed their reason, and even those who once held confidence in knowledge, in the stars, in medicine, in mathematics, began to hesitate, to doubt, to wonder if perhaps the old stories had been right all along, and that the skies truly were the battleground of angels and demons, that the trembling of the earth was not tectonic but spiritual, and that somewhere, in some heavenly ledger, the sins of mankind had been tallied and judgment had at last come due. This collapse of certainty, this erosion of the boundaries between the rational and the mythic, was not confined to one land or culture, but spread as widely as the shadow itself, and whether one lived in the remnants of the Roman world or among the forested tribes of northern Europe, whether one prayed to Christ, to Woden, to the old gods of the Nile or the mountains of Armenia, all felt the same chill, the same confusion, the same desperate grasp for meaning in a world where none seemed to be found, and so entire populations became more susceptible to visions, to dreams, to the words of prophets and madmen alike. For in desperate times, people will listen to anyone who speaks with conviction, and thus from the murk of these years emerged a new wave of seers, doomsayers, and miracle workers, their words wrapped in fire and fear, their audiences large and growing by the day. And what they preached, these men and women who claimed special knowledge or divine instruction, was often terrifying, foretelling further catastrophe, warning of cleansing fires and righteous floods, speaking of cities that would sink into the sea and of nations that would be turned to ash by the breath of angry gods. And while some dismissed them as lunatics or charlatans, others listened, knelt, wept, repented, or even turned to violence in the name of purification, for what begins as fear often ends in rage, and the longer the sun remained dim and the harvests failed and the birds flew strangely overhead, the more people began to look not just to the heavens for answers, but to their neighbors for blame. And it is in this simmering cauldron of dread and mysticism, where famine twisted the body and prophecy twisted the mind, that the seeds of a darker human impulse began to grow once again. For history teaches us that when the world turns cruel and incomprehensible, when chaos becomes the only rhythm a people know, they often reach for the old, familiar tools of control: suspicion, accusation, and punishment, and soon whispered words of guilt and betrayal would begin to circulate among the frightened, whispered in secret corners and shouted in crowded markets, and those who were once friends and neighbors would begin to look upon each other with narrowed eyes, wondering who might be the cause of all this suffering. And so the story drifted eastward, carried on the backs of whispers and weary merchants who still dared the desolate roads, toward the lands where once, long ago, light had been born each morning with grace and promise. In China, where the ancient dynasties had long governed with intricate rituals, celestial observations, and an eye toward omens, the same darkness had fallen, blotting out the stars and muddling the heavens that once charted the path of emperors and peasants alike. For here, too, the sun had dimmed, casting the empire beneath a dusky veil that refused to lift, and the grain fields that once yielded abundance had become stubborn and silent, defying the rhythm of spring and the coaxing hands of those who tended them. In the southern regions, near the rice paddies of the Yangtze River basin, Farmers found their work undone not by war or poor fortune, but by something far more elusive and terrifying. The air itself felt wrong, damp and cold where it should have been warm and nourishing, and the mists lingered far beyond their welcome. The seasons forgot their order, as if even time had grown weary of its duties, and frost was known to kiss the buds of trees at the end of summer, stealing away fruit before it ripened. In the imperial courts of the Northern Wei dynasty, astrologers wrung their hands and muttered about heavenly displeasure, while the scholars recorded in their bamboo slips and silk-bound tomes that the sun had grown faint and red, barely more than a pale shadow of its former glory, and that for months on end no stars could be seen, no moon to mark the passage of nights, just an endless gray dome of haze that neither moved nor cleared. It was a silence of color and light, a pause in the world's breath, and it crept not only across the sky but into the hearts of those who lived beneath it. In the great cities like Luoyang and Chang'an, which had once bustled with traders, officials, artisans, and the scurrying feet of servants in lacquered sandals, a strange hush began to settle. Food shortages grew worse as river transport slowed, with silt-clogged canals and weak oxen that could no longer haul the barges against the current. The price of millet rose sharply, and even the more common folk began to murmur about rebellion, though none could muster the strength for it, for hunger, after all, is the great equalizer of ambition, eroding will as easily as it does flesh. Among the Buddhist monasteries tucked in quiet valleys and wind-swept mountainsides, monks interpreted the gloom as a karmic reckoning. They chanted longer into the darkness, their incense smoke mingling with the ever-present fog, and they inscribed sutras with greater urgency, hoping that divine intervention might correct what earthly minds could not comprehend. But even their ancient wisdom failed to offer clarity, for never in the long span of dynastic memory had the land endured such a strange and universal affliction, one not of politics or conquest, but of something older and colder, something deep in the bones of the earth and high in the vaults of the sky. Some said the dragons had fled the heavens. Others believed the ghosts of forgotten kings were fighting in the underworld, stirring storms and shadows that spilled into the mortal realm. And in truth, who could say what was real? In an age before microscopes and meteorology, when myths held equal weight with fact, it was easier, perhaps even kinder, to believe in spirits than in science. For how else could one explain frost in summer, crops that withered before flowering, and children born into a world with no dawn? The tales grew longer as the nights did, and storytellers who once spun tales for coin found themselves hoarse from nightly requests to explain the inexplicable. Across the villages and hamlets, many turned inward, closing their doors against both the cold and the unknown. Families clung to one another beneath patchwork quilts, and the firewood, once plentiful, dwindled too quickly. Some burned their tools, their heirlooms, even old paper scrolls, whatever would keep the hearth alive one more night. And amid this slow unraveling of normal life, there arose another cruel twist of fate, illness, born not on the backs of rats or in the waters of wells, but seemingly from the air itself, which chafed the throat and invited weakness into the chest. Respiratory sickness spread quietly, devouring breath and strength from the old and the young alike, and even those who survived it often did so with bodies weakened and spirits dimmed. But it was not all stillness. Occasionally, the empire stirred with unease. Rebellions flickered in the provinces like brief candles against the wind, quickly snuffed out or else extinguished by hunger before they could burn too brightly. Bandits roamed the countryside. Once poor farmers turned desperate, seeking what little others had stored. The roads became unsafe, then deserted, and even the imperial envoys began to hesitate before venturing far beyond the capital's protective walls. Communications slowed to a trickle, and as letters failed to arrive, as messengers disappeared into the fog, people began to speak less, not out of fear, but out of fatigue. And above all of this loomed the question none dared answer: what if this darkness never passed? What if the world had tilted into a new age, a colder one, a hungrier one, where summer never truly returned and the stars had been stolen for good? The skies gave no reply. The clouds remained silent, heavy, indifferent. And still the sun, though it rose, gave no warmth. Just the illusion of daylight, thin, watery, and gone too soon. As the empire weathered its strange season of despair, another shadow crept along the edges of its borders, not carried by wind or ash, but in the flesh and breath of men, and its name would become infamous across continents. For far from the misty mountains and river valleys of China, in the lands to the west, another calamity was stirring, not volcanic nor celestial, but human, and soon it would spill across cities like black ink across parchment, staining history with its cruelty. And as the months passed and the years tried to right themselves, as if time itself was tired of its own grief, another burden arose in the wake of all the others, slowly but with deadly certainty. Because even as the skies began to clear and the veil of ash gradually lifted from the heavens, revealing at long last the pale ghost of a returning sun, the earth below, so long deprived of light and warmth and nourishment, had already been broken beyond the reach of easy recovery. It's exhausted. Soil starved of fertility, its crops reduced to weak imitations of what once grew in abundance, and its peoples no longer simply famished, but weakened to their bones, their immunity shattered, their spirits dimmed by the weight of hunger and the horrors of their long vigil through the dim years. And into this brittle and wounded world came something even more sinister than famine or darkness. It came in the form of sickness, a creeping, coiling, insidious blight that would travel not with armies, nor clouds, nor seasons, but in the lungs and blood of men, borne silently on the breath of travelers, on the backs of rats, within the bites of fleas, or perhaps even in the foul air that drifted through cramped cities and coastal towns, indistinguishable from the foul smells of waste and decay that had become all too familiar in a world where survival often meant living among death. The plague, as it would be called later in chronicles written by hands that somehow endured the onslaught, was not just any illness, nor a simple fever that burned hot and faded fast, but something deeper and more dreadful, something that robbed its victims of both dignity and time, striking with swiftness and cruelty, filling the body with pustules and pain, making mockery of medicine and prayer alike, and its coming, though not yet the great pestilence that would seize the world in the century to come, still offered a grim prelude to what humanity would one day know far more intimately. And in cities like Constantinople, where the traders still arrived and the ships still docked and the streets still bustled, however faintly, with the rhythms of a weary commerce, there were whispers beginning to emerge from the outer provinces, soft at first and easily dismissed, of whole villages stricken, of priests who refused to bury the dead for fear of joining them, of carts piled high with bodies that no one dared touch. And these murmurings, passed from mouth to mouth, town to town, were not shouted but sighed, as though the very act of voicing them might summon the sickness anew. And even as emperors ordered walls built and quarantines enforced, even as clerics fasted and nobles fled, there was a growing awareness, dim as the ash-clouded sun but unmistakably present, that something in the world had shifted permanently, that this long chain of miseries, beginning with the darkened skies and ending now in pustules and despair, was not a series of misfortunes, but a transformation, as though the old world, with its certainties and harvests and gods who listened, had been severed from time itself, left behind like a severed limb, and what remained was something less predictable, more fragile, and altogether more frightening. And as the sick coughed and the healthy watched them with quiet dread, as the learned searched scrolls for cures that would not come and the illiterate simply waited for death, there emerged a new kind of silence in the cities, not the silence of darkness nor the silence of snow, but a silence of avoidance, of doors closed tightly, of families whispering rather than speaking, of markets growing empty not from hunger but from fear. And in this growing hush, the plague carved its first cruel mark upon a world already brought to its knees. Yet even then, amidst the silence and sickness and suspicion, life persisted, if only by habit. People still lit lamps in the evenings and mumbled half-remembered prayers over meager bowls of gruel. They still swept their thresholds with trembling hands and tried, as best they could, to keep the rituals of a life that no longer resembled the one they remembered, and in this act of persistence, of simply waking, simply breathing, simply surviving in the face of a world that had lost all semblance of order or promise, there was a quiet heroism that no chronicler would ever fully capture, because it was not the heroism of swords or sermons, but of enduring another dusk, another cold wind, another meal of bark and boiled roots, another cough in the dark that might not go away by morning. And it was in this slow, relentless endurance that the people of 536 and the years that followed carved out their place in history, not as conquerors or builders, but as survivors of the worst year to be. Alive, survivors who, though bent by sorrow, were not yet broken. And as the plague moved on, retreating or mutating or simply fading into the weary hush of the times, it left behind more than graves and ashes. It left behind a changed people, older somehow than their years, eyes shadowed not with sleep but with knowledge, and it was in these altered eyes, staring out at a world that might one day recover, that the final tragedy of that time was written, not in blood or famine or ash, but in the silent understanding that the world before 536 would never return. And so the harvests failed again, with neither sun nor season to guide the hands of those who still dared to plant seed in the dead, cold soil, and the cycle of suffering rippled outward into every layer of society, no matter how remote or hidden from the world's chaos they might have once seemed, for even the monasteries, those hushed, distant sanctuaries of parchment and prayer, found their cloisters darkened not only by the absence of sunlight, but by the steady erosion of their fragile order. And within the stone walls of these ancient places, men of quiet words and ink-stained fingers, who once copied Scripture by candlelight and rang bells to mark the rhythms of day and night, now found themselves facing the same uncertain emptiness as the peasants in the fields, the merchants at the ports, and the kings in their silent halls, because no amount of devotion or contemplation could conjure bread from famine or light from skyless days. In the monasteries of Gaul, of Britannia, of the Alpine valleys and the desolate coasts of Hibernia, the monks recorded their quiet despair not in sermons or grand declarations, but in margins and footnotes, in the trembling Latin script of half-starved scribes who left behind strange comments among their psalms and chronicles, words like "sol non lucet," the sun does not shine, repeated with dull resignation, or grim inventories of failing crops and lost brethren, scribbled between lines of sacred verse, a kind of quiet acknowledgment that even the most faithful had no answer for the shadows that had swallowed the world. And in these places, where time had always been measured by bells and seasons, the absence of a proper sunrise became more than just a meteorological anomaly. It disrupted everything. The scheduling of fasts and feasts, the planting of sacred herbs, the brewing of medicinal tinctures, and the simple comfort of knowing that each day had an ordained beginning and end. Without light, the monks began to miscount their days, to lose track of the liturgical calendar, and in that confusion came a slow spiritual erosion, not loud or heretical, but weary and resigned, as if even the divine had turned his face away from the earth. In Ireland, some chroniclers would later remember this time not for the cold or the crop failures, but for the silence that crept into every stone cell, the silence of brothers who no longer chanted at matins, who no longer whispered homilies in the refectory, their voices worn away by hunger, or taken altogether by the sicknesses that swept through their ranks, for where famine made bodies weak, and fear made hearts frail, disease found no resistance, and it came not in the form of grand plagues, but in slow afflictions, fevers that lingered for weeks, coughs that rattled lungs for months, sores that refused to heal under the ointments of the apothecary monks, and in time, even the abbot's records grew sparse, as if the very parchment had become too heavy for hands that trembled with weariness. And in the east, among the orthodox monasteries nestled in the Anatolian hills and the bleak highlands of Cappadocia, the same pattern unfolded, with scrolls abandoned mid-copy, prayer books left unfinished, and novices turning away from lives of service in search of food or warmth or the simple reassurance of a sky not choked with ash. Some wandered off in search of rumored oases of survival, valleys where the mist thinned for a few hours, or monasteries said to be miraculously spared the famine, and though most found only more desolation, a few left behind accounts of distant places where tiny pockets of warmth remained, where the cloisters had somehow managed to preserve their orchards, or where a spring fed a fish pond that had not yet dried up, and in this bleak age, such rumors became as precious as relics, carried from monastery to monastery with a kind of reverence normally reserved for saints' bones or sacred chalices. But the truth was that even in those rare places where light persisted or food remained, the spiritual weight of the year 536 could not be lifted, for what made this time so devastating was not merely the lack of sustenance or the endless twilight, but the profound uncertainty it imposed upon the human soul, the crumbling of all that was predictable, the unraveling of rhythms that had ordered human life for centuries, and the slow realization that no one, not kings or clerics or saints, could explain what was happening or when it would end. And so, across the known world, in scriptoria and abbeys, in lonely chapels and hidden hermitages, the sacred silence once cherished by monastic orders became something darker, something hollow and grim, filled with unanswered prayers and the faint scratching of pens that now recorded not glory or revelation, but absence, loss, and a world where even the sacred seemed uncertain. This absence bled outward, seeping from the cloisters into the hearts of the people who once looked to these holy men for wisdom and comfort, and when the monks no longer spoke with confidence, when their scrolls no longer predicted the return of light, when their relics no longer seemed to ward off sickness or summon the rains, the common folk turned their eyes elsewhere, not necessarily toward heresy or rebellion, but toward older fears, deeper superstitions, ancient whispers that the world had fallen out of favor with the divine, or worse, that the gods of old had returned to claim their vengeance in the form of sky-darkening clouds and soul-sapping hunger. And in this swirl of confusion, as the year wore on and still no clarity came, the social order began to shift once more, setting the stage for consequences far stranger and more transformative than anyone in those cold monasteries could have anticipated. And so the year trudged forward, dragging its wounded body toward what some might have hoped would be a gentler chapter, but instead it delivered yet another blow, this time not through fire or sky or plague, but in the realm of the deeply human, in the intimate networks of trade, connection, and communication that once made the ancient world feel, if not safe, then at least knowable. For now the roads were silent, and the seas, once bustling with galleys heavy with wine, olive oil, and letters written in careful Latin or Greek, had grown eerily still. The merchants who had once bartered spices for silks or traded northern furs for Egyptian grain found themselves landlocked by fear and disoriented by the breakdown of the very systems that had underpinned the economic and social lifeblood of the ancient world. Trade routes, once vibrant arteries stretching from the Levant to the Atlantic, from Alexandria to Constantinople, grew stunted and stale as travelers feared the sickness that lingered in cities and the unpredictability of a climate that no longer obeyed any season. The Silk Road, which once shimmered with caravans bearing fine Chinese goods and Persian dyes, became less a promise and more a ghost. Bandits, once content to prey in scattered stretches, now claimed entire paths as their own, emboldened by the collapse of authority and the desperation of local governors who could barely feed their own garrisons. In ports like Antioch and Ostia, where once the docks would ring with the songs of sailors and the clatter of amphorae being offloaded from distant ships, only the sound of gulls remained, circling above waters that held more driftwood than commerce. The sea lanes of the Mediterranean, once so vital and reliable, became dangerous and deserted, the ships fewer, the crews more ragged, the destinations uncertain. Maritime trade, which had long carried not only goods but ideas, languages, and news across continents, now faltered under the weight of uncertainty, as storms became more frequent, fogs more impenetrable, and famine made every port wary of visitors who might be begging instead of bartering. But it wasn't merely that goods stopped flowing or that cities grew poorer. It was that the very imagination of the people began to shrink, the world becoming smaller not because of walls or borders, but because of the creeping fear of the unknown. The flow of news, of letters from distant family members or edicts from faraway emperors, slowed to a trickle. Messengers disappeared on roads swallowed by bandits or blizzards, and rumors replaced reports, stories of distant lands swallowed by fire, of cities drowning beneath frozen rains, of entire peoples marching away from their dead homelands with nothing but rags and gods that no longer answered prayers. In monasteries and courts alike, there was a growing sense that something had been lost, not just materially, but mentally, that the world people had once known was receding into memory like a shoreline swallowed by mist. Maps grew outdated not because of geographical changes, but because the paths they depicted were no longer passable, their names now hollow with disuse. In Constantinople, even as Emperor Justinian struggled to maintain the illusion of a strong and enduring empire, he could not ignore the reports, now fewer, now vaguer, that reached him from the outposts of empire. North Africa's grain harvests had failed again, and Egypt's Nile, the ancient heartbeat of its civilization, had run low and listless, offering little nourishment to the hungry millions downstream. From Britain, there was no word at all. The far-flung island had vanished behind a curtain of cold and silence. In Gaul and Hispania, bishops wrote to one another in increasingly frantic tones, their Latin deteriorating in elegance but intensifying in despair, chronicling churches left half-built, monks dying in silence, and towns that had simply emptied overnight. The unity of the old Roman world, already tenuous and riddled with fractures, now cracked further as localism took hold, and villages turned inward, suspicious of strangers, ignorant of distant events, and consumed by their own survival. What emerged in place of the once lively rhythms of commerce and correspondence was a deep and gnawing isolation. No longer could a farmer expect that his surplus barley might find its way to a baker in another province. No longer could a scribe hope to hear the latest theological debates from Alexandria. No longer did artisans wait with anticipation for pigments or parchment or glass from faraway workshops. The people of 536 became, each in their own way, a little more cut off, a little more alone. And in that isolation, new fears bloomed. Superstition festered in the absence of knowledge. Folk tales darkened in tone. Even among the educated, whispers of omens and curses, of divine punishments and apocalyptic signs began to eclipse the rational explanations that once guided inquiry and discourse. In the East, Persian merchants who once rode the long desert trade routes to meet Roman counterparts found themselves turned away, or worse, attacked by villagers who feared that the foreign clothes they wore and the strange accents they spoke might bring with them disease or disaster. In the West, Celtic tribes who had maintained modest trade with southern Europe now relied on their own forests and streams, suspicious of southern goods and the strange smells of unfamiliar wares. Even within cities, neighbors grew wary of one another. The sharing of goods, once so central to survival and cohesion, now invited suspicion. Was that sack of flour a gift or a trap? Would taking a stranger's meat invite their illness into your home? Was the foreign merchant outside the gate a savior or a sign of doom? Amid this collapse of trade and trust, cultures began to fracture. Language shifted more quickly now, as dialects hardened into incomprehensibility, and regions that once shared religious rites or civic customs began to diverge. Without the thread of commerce and communication stitching the world together, people became not only more separate but more strange to one another. The Roman identity, once carried on coins and amphorae, in law codes and military badges, faded into regionalisms and tribal loyalties, into local saints and pagan resurgences, into tales whispered in firelight that bore no trace of imperial pride. The very idea of a shared world, a world where a decision in Byzantium might matter to a village in Gaul, became not only remote but absurd. And as this profound unspooling of connectivity continued, as caravans failed to arrive and ships were left to rot in harbor, a deep spiritual hunger grew. For people do not merely survive on food and fire, but on stories, on knowledge of others, on the sense that one is part of something larger. In 536, that thread frayed, and the world felt smaller not because it was more comprehensible, but because it had become more unknowable. And in that thickening silence, people turned to the only powers that seemed still present, still listening, those of gods, old and new, whose anger might be soothed or whose favor might be bought in candlelight and prayer. Thus, as the material world collapsed into isolation, a spiritual one took root, casting long shadows of faith and fear over a people desperate for meaning in the silence. And so, the deep hush that settled over the lands was no longer just a shroud of cold and shadow, but something deeper and more invisible, an erosion of belief itself, the crumbling of the unseen foundations upon which ancient societies had always stood. After all, if the skies no longer obeyed the rhythms of the sun, and the seasons no longer answered to the call of the stars, then what remained to suggest that the gods were listening, or that the old rites had meaning, or that the world moved forward in any direction other than inward toward collapse? These weren't just rhetorical questions posed by philosophers in the dim light of Roman libraries or whispered among monks huddled in drafty scriptoriums. They were real doubts infecting the thoughts of farmers, priests, nobles, and commoners alike, and slowly seeping into the marrow of every civilization still clinging to the idea that their world was ordained and meaningful. For in the disjointed years following 536, belief itself had begun to decay. From the pagans of northern Europe, whose sacred groves stood cold and untouched beneath ashen skies, to the Zoroastrians of Persia, whose fire temples flickered weakly in the choking air, the world's spiritual scaffolding buckled under the strain of silence from the heavens. Even in the Christian world, which had flourished after centuries of persecution, the crisis took on a distinctly theological flavor. For how could divine providence be reconciled with a sun that refused to shine, or with crops that failed regardless of prayer, or with plagues that swept away the righteous and sinful alike with equal cruelty? In many towns and villages, priests were left to lead services for congregations too starved to kneel or too sick to respond, their sermons thinly veiled laments wrapped in Scripture, their prayers rising up not toward an ethereal Father, but into a sky so gray and silent it may as well have been made of stone. And still the darkness endured. In Constantinople, where imperial banners fluttered without their usual color and sacred processions marched beneath a pallid sky, Emperor Justinian sought solace in the opulence of mosaics and incense, doubling down on the divine nature of his rule while issuing new edicts and building new churches in an attempt to earn divine favor. Or perhaps just to distract his people from the sense that even heaven itself had turned its gaze away. He was not alone. In other corners of the collapsing world, rulers clung to ritual with desperate intensity, organizing fasts, processions, and collective prayers that filled city streets with the sick and the weeping, many of whom died mid-hymn or collapsed before ever reaching the altar. Prophets, both self-appointed and sanctioned, arose in every land, declaring that the end had come, that judgment was upon them, that the sins of the people had darkened the sun. Their words, often laced with dread and doom, found eager ears. After all, when every day felt like twilight and every breath carried the scent of death, who could argue that some cosmic punishment had not descended? And yet for every voice declaring divine retribution, there were others, quieter, more uncertain, who whispered that perhaps the gods had simply left. Perhaps the old myths had been wrong, the old pantheons mistaken, the prayers wasted. If there was no wrath from the heavens, perhaps it was because there were no heavens. The unsettling idea crept in like cold into an unsealed room, undermining not only faith but the sense of moral order it once upheld. If suffering came without reason, then so too might cruelty and theft and betrayal. In some regions, lawlessness bloomed like mold in the cracks of abandoned villages. Families turned on each other over scraps of food. Soldiers deserted their posts. Religious relics were stolen and sold or ground into powder and swallowed by the desperate who believed them magical. And always, the questions loomed large and heavy. Was the world still guided by something higher? Was there still order in the heavens? Was anyone listening? In the face of so much silence, new explanations took root, ones that did not require gods at all. Strange tales circulated, not of divine punishment, but of celestial events and natural disasters. Some told of a star falling from the sky, others of a vast cloud risen from the earth itself. In China, records spoke of yellow dust and missing suns. In the West, scribes speculated about eclipses and comets. And while none understood what had truly happened, these murmurings marked the faint birth of a different kind of understanding, one rooted not in prophecy, but in observation, in record-keeping, in the notion that nature, not deity, might be the author of fate. It was a fragile idea, far from science as we now know it, but its emergence amid spiritual decay was telling. Even as belief faltered, curiosity stirred. Still, for most, the old stories remained the only thread by which meaning could be grasped. And so they held tighter to them, even as they frayed. They built new altars, carried sacred bones through ruined towns, invoked saints and ancestors with frantic, trembling voices. Some turned to darker practices, sacrifices, exorcisms, grim rituals pulled from the shadowy margins of ancient tradition. In Scandinavia, runes were carved and buried beneath frozen soil. In Anatolia, ritual fires were lit despite the ash-filled air. In Gaul, strange processions wound through dead orchards, singing songs older than Rome itself. Whether they worked was irrelevant. They gave the illusion of agency, a structure to the chaos, a way to pretend the world could still be known and perhaps still be saved. And through all of this, the sky remained dim, the earth remained cold, and the people remained lost, their faith flickering like the final embers of a fire no one could rekindle. But even as belief bent under the weight of suffering, it did not break entirely. Something in the human soul, perhaps memory, perhaps hope, refused to let go. They kept building, praying, planting. They passed down the stories, told the children that light would return, that summer would come again. And perhaps, in that quiet insistence, in that stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to despair, there was a different kind of faith, one not grounded in doctrine or deity, but in the sheer, enduring will to endure. And as the final notes of ritual faded into the gray air, another sound began to rise, a quiet stirring in the soil, a whisper in the roots, a breath beneath the frost, that hinted, faintly and distantly, at the possibility that this long night might one day end. And so, as the fragile glow of the returning sun finally crept over the frost-bitten shoulders of a battered Europe, there was no grand fanfare, no sudden eruption of joy or triumph, no celebration to mark the end of the long, harrowing shadow that had cloaked the world for more than a decade. There was only a hesitant stillness, as if the earth itself was unsure whether it was safe to breathe again. The birds, once silent in the ash-darkened skies, began to sing again, not in jubilant chorus but in cautious fragments, their melodies tentative, as though they too remembered the silence that had gripped the land for so long. Trees that had withered from lack of light now began to push forth pale green shoots, reaching toward a sky that had been blackened and bruised, now slowly returning to its familiar hues. In the fields, where skeletal remains of crops once stood like reminders of loss, tiny blades of wheat emerged, thin, trembling, almost translucent. The people, gaunt and weary, ventured from their crumbling dwellings not with celebration in their hearts, but with an animal-like uncertainty, blinking into the reluctant sunlight, unsure whether this fragile warmth was real or just another cruel trick from the heavens that had forsaken them so many times before. They carried with them memories that would never truly fade, of the endless gray days when time itself seemed frozen, of the nights filled with coughs and cries and prayers that never reached any listening God. They remembered how each season blurred into the next without joy or change, how years passed with a monotony of suffering, and how even hope, once a stubborn ember, had almost flickered out entirely. Yet, with the same quiet resilience that had sustained them through the worst, they stepped forward, one foot after another, rebuilding not with optimism but with obligation, because there was simply nothing else to do. No sermons were spoken, no tales written in that moment to mark the end of the misery, because most could not even read, and the ones who could were too weary to waste ink on a time that all agreed should be forgotten. But history, like ash in the wind, has a way of settling into every crevice, leaving a residue that refuses to be washed away. And though the year 536 slowly became memory, passed down in whispers and warnings, its impact remained etched not only into the bones of buildings and the thin soil of the farms, but in the very psyche of those who survived. For even generations later, when the skies had long returned to blue and the sun shone without shame, there lingered in the minds of the descendants a vague, inherited fear, of darkness that overstayed its welcome, of crops that failed without cause, of a world that could betray its inhabitants without a whisper of warning. The monks who chronicled that year and the ones that followed did not embellish with poetic flair, for the truth needed no dramatization. Their ink recorded what was necessary: the sun's dimming, the chill that never lifted, the hunger that twisted the soul, and the silence that stretched between the living and the dead. And as we sit now, centuries later, beneath electric skies and artificial light, warmed by radiators and wrapped in blankets spun in factories, it is easy to forget that there was a time when the sun did not rise properly, when the wind carried more than just cold, and when the world itself seemed to pause in a breathless stillness of dread. But if you close your eyes and let the quiet settle in, you might still feel something, just faintly, in the rhythm of your pulse or the chill in your spine, the echo of a year when light itself was lost, and humanity stumbled blindly through the dim corridors of a twilight world, whispering ancient prayers and holding tightly to the belief that the darkness would not last forever. And perhaps that, in the end, is the softest lesson of it all, that even in the bleakest year in human history, when death and despair circled like wolves and even the sun abandoned the sky, something persisted. Not strength in the heroic sense, not triumph in the grand sense, but something quieter and more fragile: endurance. The slow, aching, fragile determination to see one more day, to bury the dead and mend the roof and plant again in fallow ground. A kind of human light that could not be extinguished even when the heavens turned away. So now, as your eyelids grow heavier and the hush of night surrounds you, let the darkness no longer be something to fear, but simply a place where rest waits. You are safe now, far from that cold and colorless year. The fires are warm, the earth is kind, and the sun, faithful once more, will rise again tomorrow. Sleep well. The long shadow of 536 is behind us now.